So continuing to think about grading for a growth mindset, I want to talk a little bit about making learning visible by creating opportunities for students to compare their work with clearly defined learning targets and success criteria. And when we do that, we dispel the learning mystery for students. So I'm going to take you back to some previous learning, a few of Hattie's top influences on achievement. If you remember, when we first got started in this course, we talked a lot about what has the greatest impact on students' learning from a book called Visible Learning for Teachers, Maximizing Impact on Learning by John Hattie. So if you recall, a few of Hattie's top influences on achievement were student self-assessment, providing formative evaluations, so that's teachers being evaluated on their ability to produce learning, feedback, that is feedback teachers provide to students that's actionable and fair, accurate, specific, and timely. Also teacher clarity. We've talked a lot about teacher clarity and the importance of providing learning targets students can understand, along with success criteria and even exemplars that students can see are examples of the end products that they are going to want to create. And I really believe that when you are receiving feedback on your teaching from peers or administrators, and you are having students engage in student self-assessment and giving them great feedback and providing teacher clarity, it is very likely that the end result of that is you are establishing meaningful and strong relationships with students. And I say that because all of this work is what allows for you to build a relationship with students whereby they view you as someone that really values them as learners and values the work that they're completing. So these are things that I really want to emphasize for you to continue to focus on as you develop the skills necessary for becoming a highly effective teacher. Today's going to be about feedback and teacher clarity, again through that lens of grading for a growth mindset. So we've talked a little bit about articulating learning targets and success criteria in kid-friendly rubrics. Today's going to be about specifically looking at how to design rubrics for formative assessment and feedback. There are a couple different kinds of rubrics, and the actual names of these are not really important for you to know. But one type of rubric is an analytic rubric. It's for learning and feedback. It's not for purposes of providing a score. Another kind of rubric is for purposes of grading or summative assessment, and that's called a holistic rubric. Another way to think about rubrics is to think about them as being very general versus being very task specific. So I'm going to use a lot of this language as we move through this presentation. A general rubric has a description at various levels of success that students can compare their work to. Task specific is like a checklist. Students can look at the task specific checklist and determine, have they met all of the criteria? Do they have 5 paragraphs? Do they have a thesis statement? Do they have a topic sentence at the beginning of each paragraph? Do they have a sentence of summary at the end of each paragraph? And if they have those things, they hand it in, they assume that they've met all the criteria for the assignment. That's much different than actually comparing the substance and content of their work to what success would look like in a more generalized way, in a more analytic way, in a way that is for learning and ultimately for feedback. So let's talk about general analytic rubrics. They are intended to provide detailed descriptions of what performance looks like at various levels of skill. Those levels of skill might be beginning, developing, secure, might be initiating, refining, sustaining. However it is you determine what the levels are, they should build on each other, and they should provide students great opportunities to compare their work. The point of a general rubric is not to judge student performance. It's really intended to describe what the performance should look like. So general rubrics, again, describe that detailed description to which students can compare their work. It should be high inference work for students. We're going to talk about that in a second. The major key to writing a strong, effective general rubric is to clearly define what proficient work looks like. And not to just define it in the rubric, but to include with that rubric an example of what proficient work looks like. I like to provide an example of what proficient work looks like and then still have a category on the rubric for exemplary work. And I don't give exemplars of exemplary work. And the reason for that is I want students to think on their own for what moving beyond a basic level of proficiency would look like. So in fact, it's interesting when I ask students, can I use this assignment as an exemplar? That, by the way, makes students feel really good about their work. And I don't need to share this with students, but usually I'm asking for proficient work, not necessarily exemplary work. And that's purposeful because, again, you want students to come up with their own understanding, their own approach to moving beyond what you have defined as proficiency. They can use the criteria in the rubric to do it. So what's the difference then between a general rubric that provides these great descriptions, these thorough descriptions, and a task-specific rubric? Well, task-specific rubrics, again, are essentially checklists, and they're great. They serve a purpose, but they sometimes are disguised as general rubrics, when in reality, they're really just a checklist of things that students should make sure they've incorporated into their assignment. So it might be has 6 facts, has a picture related to each fact, is neat, uses correct grammar. If they can check all those boxes, then they're ready to hand it in. Again, that's all well and good, and it has a role to play in helping students make sure that they're striving for accuracy and meeting expectations. But checklists are not going to be high inference work for students. It's very low inference work. They have to make very clear-cut, easy decisions about whether their work is meeting the criteria, whereas a general rubric that includes much more thorough descriptions of what you're asking them to do, that requires a lot of thought, a lot of comparison, a lot of drawing conclusions and making decisions in comparing and contrasting the work that students have completed with what the descriptions are in the rubric. Much different than the task-specific list. So checklists measure a student's ability to comply with assignment instructions, and again are low inference work for students and teachers. I do like the idea of a pre-flight checklist, calling it a pre-flight checklist for students right before they hand in a fairly large assignment to make sure that they've actually met the basic requirements of that assignment. But that, again, is entirely different than having them compare their work to give themselves some feedback. So here's an example of a rubric that is actually disguised as a general rubric, but is really nothing more than a task-specific checklist. Okay, you can see here it's got 4 levels, and the levels build on each other, but in the end, they either have 6 facts or they don't. They either have graphics for each topic, or they either have a poster that's attractive in terms of design, layout, and neatness, or they don't. You could do the same rubric that you're seeing here in a checklist that you see here. My state poster has 6 facts, has a picture related to each fact, is neat, uses correct grammar. Do you see the difference between this as a checklist and this disguising itself as a rubric? It's a common mistake that teachers make. They think these 3 indicators are good, they think they've got these levels, and that's all well and good, but the reality is this is more of a checklist than a general analytic rubric. So how do rubrics dispel the mystery of learning? They can be shared with students at the beginning of an assignment to help them plan and monitor their work. If used correctly, students are comparing the incremental progress they're making toward completing a larger assignment or project with their rubric frequently, and or they are using other students' work to compare it to the rubric and give them feedback on where they think they are. The other thing is the rubric should absolutely be used to dispel the learning mystery at the beginning or onset of learning, with an exemplar. So give students the rubric, give them an exemplar, have them determine where within the rubric that exemplar lands. You don't have to give the same exemplar to every student or every group of students. Give some students a exemplar that would fall in the beginning level. Give students an exemplar that falls in the middle level, developing, or give students an exemplar that ends at the sustaining level. Help them see the various levels of work and get them to make sure that they are practicing using actual student work and comparing it to the descriptions in your general or analytic rubric. So how else do they spell a learning mystery? They can be used with many different tasks. So focusing the students on knowledge and skills they are developing over time. So a lot of this is you don't have to create a rubric for everything that you do, but if you have identified priority standards or priority learning, to figure out a way in which to use that rubric over time so that to begin the learning, you can say to students, I don't expect you to move beyond developing or to move beyond refining at this point, because we're going to continue to practice and spiral back to these skills and concepts with the hope that eventually the expectation will be that you move beyond proficiency. And again, always wanting to help students understand where they should be given where the amount of time that they might have left within a particular unit or within a particular semester or school year. You shouldn't feel like you need to be beyond refining right now, and help them understand real clearly this is what refining looks like. You're either here or you're leading up to that in some sort of developing column or some sort of beginning column. General rubrics help students of all ages build up a concept of what it means to perform a skill well. And you really are going to continue to teach that idea of a growth mindset if you provide with ample opportunity to progress further to a level of secure within the rubric. Help them see that they've moved from beginning to developing. Help them reflect on what it was they did differently, or the amount of time or practice that went into moving from beginning to developing. And you can do this in any content area, but I promise you, as students start making connections to better performance with what they did to increase that performance, the likelihood of them thinking intelligence is malleable, or their ability to learn can continue to grow, will increase. And that's really the goal. It's to a lot, to an extent, the purpose of why we teach. Every student should finish your class or middle school or high school with an increased belief in their ability to learn and produce their desired result. The focus of the teacher is on developing students' learning of skills instead of task completion. That's why task-specific rubrics are not always the best thing. They play a role, but if all we're doing is teaching students to finish their work and finish their work on time, it's likely that we're sacrificing a lot of learning in order for that to happen. And if time is fixed, if learning is the variable and time is fixed, it is likely that students will develop a fixed mindset. It needs to be that time is the variable. We can manipulate the time in which it takes a student to show what they know or can do. And learning is what's malleable. It doesn't matter how long it takes a kid to learn it. We're going to give them the time that they need to show what they know or can do, especially as it relates to standards we've prioritized. So why are rubrics important? I believe that when we clearly characterize what student work should look like, instruction, assessment, and learning improve. And this is straight from Susan Brookhardt's book on rubrics. And I think it's really important to understand that no matter what content area you are in, you can use rubrics to help dispel the learning mystery. So again, to review, the purpose of a general rubric is to compare the performance of a student to the descriptions of work within each skill level. It is intended to be high inference work. When students complain that it's taking a long time or there's so much to compare, that is okay. You want students to think critically about how their work compares to what you are articulating is varying levels of success or proficiency. Thinking is hard. Remember, Hattie and Willingham have clearly shown our brain is not set up in such a way that we enjoy thinking, that we enjoy having the exhaustive task of thinking. But we need to engage students in that process as much as possible and provide for them some high inference work in comparing what they've done to what you say success looks like. More importantly, general rubrics allow teachers and students to match their work to clear descriptions of successful learning. The more students are working with and seeing what success looks like, the more likely they are to up their level of expectation for their work. And while I'm on that thought, I want you to always think about whether or not the work is primarily geared toward you as the audience, you as the teacher as the primary audience, or whether you can get students to think bigger about who their audience is. When students think the audience of their work is their peers or the public, they will make sure their work is good. If they think the audience is just you, the teacher, they are more likely to just make sure their work is good enough. And there's a big difference between good enough and good. All right, so how do you create a rubric? Use descriptions for the levels rather than a rating scale 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. I don't like rating scales 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. It denotes a score of some sort. So use a scale like beginning, developing, secure, initiating, implementing, refining, sustaining, something like that. Or have students come up with their own levels of understanding. That's what would really make a responsive rubric. Give students an opportunity to create the levels themselves, and or align the levels of your rubric to something that you know is of great interest to them. If they're younger learners and they really like Toy Story, for example, I'm going to show you a Toy Story rubric. Maybe it's boy bands, maybe it's baseball teams. Whatever it is, get kids to think about what the various levels would be that they would want to use to compare their work to. Then you're going to define proficient. Once you have the levels, maybe it's beginning, developing, secure. The first key is to define what it means to be proficient. Once you've defined proficient work, and you should have a couple different indicators, right? It's not just going to be one component of the assignment. There's probably 2 to 3, maybe 4 indicators for each assignment, which is the very left-hand column of the rubric. Once you define what proficient looks like in each of those indicators, and you're going to write a clear and detailed example from which students will compare their work, you're then going to move to what proficiency would look like just before, right? What would it look like just before proficiency, and what would it look like just beyond proficiency? It must be a continuum. Your rubric must show this is likely what your work would look like right before you're proficient. This is what it looks like when you are. This is what it might look like if you're moving beyond what it means to be proficient. You're moving into a higher level of mastery. So ask yourself, what does student work look like at each level of quality? Beginning, developing, secure, or initiating, implementing, refining, which would be kind of the proficient level, and sustaining. The key to this, and it's hard when you're in your first year of teaching, but the key is to use previous student work. So you might create a rubric where you don't have the benefit of student work, but then the following year, look at what you got from students and say, you know what, this is a great example of what I was hoping students would create, and then use that student work to help characterize and describe what proficient work looks like. The biggest key, I think, to creating a rubric is a willingness to revise it, especially when you find that it's not helping students make actionable changes to their work. If students compare what they've done to the descriptions in the rubric and they have no sense for what they might do differently, or they may take something from it and then alter their work in a way that doesn't actually move them from one level to a higher level, you probably need to revise your rubric. So think about it in terms of whether what students got from that rubric was actually having the impact that you wanted it to have. And if it doesn't, you got to be willing to revise it. So I hope that helps you understand using rubrics and dispelling the learning mystery through rubrics that are kid friendly. Thank you.